My boots sank to the knee before I even cleared the porch step. I froze there, half outside, expecting to see the familiar sweep of plow lights cutting through the dark. Instead, the neighborhood had been erased. No road. No cars. Just a wall of white so thick it swallowed sound itself. I listened. Nothing answered back. Then I saw the lights. An ambulance sat at the gate, hazard lights clicking uselessly, each flash disappearing into the storm. A patrol car idled behind it, boxed in. Parked sideways across the entrance was an HOA security truck, clean tires, engine warm, not stuck, not accidental. Deliberate. The HOA board leader stood in front of it, perfectly calm. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. She checked her watch and spoke softly, the kind of voice that makes people lean in. "Policy is policy," she said, smiling politely. "No unauthorized access." Behind me, a woman broke down screaming that her husband needed dialysis today. The police hesitated, whispering about private roads and jurisdiction. Wind rattled the siding. The ambulance lights kept clicking, hollow and useless. And in that moment, the truth landed heavy in my chest. The snow crews hadn't missed us. They'd been turned away on purpose. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? When I bought this place, everyone told me the same thing. Winters up here don't forgive mistakes. This neighborhood sits right at the edge of the mountain line, where storms don't drift through and melt by noon. They arrive, they pile up, and they stay. That was why I felt safe moving in. For years before us, the HOA had handled snow the right way. Same local contractor every season. Crews who knew the curves of the road, the blind hills, the stretch near the gate where ice always formed first. When a storm hit, you didn't even need to look outside. You could hear the plows before dawn, metal scraping, engines rumbling, the sound of things being handled. Those sounds mattered. The first winter after we moved in went exactly like everyone promised. Roads cleared early, salt down before sunrise. School buses running slow but steady. Emergency access never even crossed my mind because it didn't have to. It was built into the routine. Quiet competence. That routine ended with the board election. The new HOA board leader showed up talking about efficiency and exposure. She loved those words. Everything was framed as liability, cost control, risk management. At first, it sounded reasonable. She spoke calmly, confidently, like someone who had already decided what was best for everyone else. Then she brought up the snow contract. She said the association had been overpaying for years. Said she could renegotiate better terms. Said canceling the current contract was temporary, just until new bids came in. She smiled while she said it, as if it were obvious. A smart business move. People asked what would happen if a storm hit in the meantime. She said crews would be authorized later if needed. That phrase stuck. Emails started circulating once weather forecasts turned serious. Long-range warnings, heavy accumulation, prolonged freezing temperatures. Residents forwarded screenshots, links, local alerts. Parents asked about school access. Older neighbors asked about medical transport. One resident mentioned home oxygen equipment. The replies came back polished and dismissive. There was no need to panic. The board had things under control. Every response circled back to the same point: access. Who was allowed through the gate? Who wasn't? Liability if an unauthorized contractor damaged the road. Liability if someone slipped. Liability if protocol wasn't followed. The word control showed up more often than safety, more often than emergency, more often than people. That's when I started feeling uneasy. The night the storm arrived, the air felt wrong. Too quiet at first, then suddenly alive with wind. Snow started falling hard and fast, not drifting, just stacking. I checked my phone before bed. More alerts, updated warnings. Historic accumulation possible. I waited for the sound I'd grown used to. Plows staging nearby, engines idling in the distance. Nothing. Sometime after midnight, the power flickered. The house groaned under gusts of wind. Snow slid off the roof in heavy sheets. I refreshed my email again, hoping for reassurance, for a message saying crews were on standby. Instead, there it was. A short message from the HOA, timestamped just hours earlier. No greeting. No explanation. Just one sentence, carefully written and impossible to misunderstand. No contractors permitted until further notice. I read it again, then again. Outside, the snow kept falling, thick enough to smother sound. The wind pressed against the house like a warning. And standing there in the dim kitchen light, staring at that email, I understood something that hadn't fully formed until that moment. This wasn't delay. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't budget trouble. It was a decision. By morning, the neighborhood would be buried. And the people in charge had already chosen control over access, policy over safety, silence over responsibility. Morning came without relief. No engines, no scraping steel. Just a flat gray sky pressing down on a neighborhood frozen in place. I opened the door and the cold rushed in, sharp enough to sting my eyes. Snow stood shoulder high along the road, packed tight, untouched. Cars were buried so completely they looked abandoned. There wasn't a single tire track anywhere. It felt less like a storm aftermath and more like a place the world had forgotten. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Neighbors asking the same question in different words. Where are the plows? Has anyone heard anything? Can you get out? I didn't wait for another HOA message. I pulled up the number for the snow contractor the community had used for years and called. He answered immediately, already tired of explaining. Before I could finish, he told me they'd been ready all night, trucks fueled, drivers staged. They rolled toward the neighborhood just after midnight and were stopped cold at the gate. HOA security was waiting for them, written order in hand. No entry. If they crossed the gate, they'd be fined and blacklisted from future work in the area. He said the word explicitly, like he wanted it on record. I stood there staring at the snow while he talked, my breath fogging the air, a tight pressure forming behind my ribs. This wasn't weather failure. This was enforcement. Outside, panic spread fast once people understood. Parents stood at the ends of driveways on their phones, already calling schools, bosses, anyone who might understand why they couldn't move. A neighbor knocked on my door, voice shaking, asking if I'd heard anything. His wife had a medical appointment she couldn't miss. Another woman stood in the street crying, telling someone she couldn't get out and didn't know what to do. That was when the HOA board leader arrived. She didn't rush. She didn't look surprised. Her vehicle stopped where the snow grew thickest, as if she wanted to make a point. She stepped out slowly, coat neat, expression calm. When people started talking over each other, she lifted one hand, not to quiet them, but to signal that she was in charge. She spoke softly. She reminded everyone this was a private community, that we had all agreed to private governance, that unauthorized contractors posed liability risks. Her voice never rose. She didn't need it to. Every sentence landed clean and final, like a door closing. I stepped forward and tried to keep my voice steady. I asked about emergencies, about ambulances, about kids and elderly residents. I pointed toward the hill leading out of the neighborhood, now solid ice under fresh snow. I told her this wasn't about convenience. It was about safety. She smiled politely and said safety was exactly why protocols existed. When someone mentioned the contractor being turned away, she didn't deny it. She said the board had full authority over access and that the contractor had been properly warned. When another neighbor asked how long this would last, she checked her watch before answering. She said residents needed to stop interfering with board operations, that continued disruption could result in fines. that any attempt to bring in independent plow drivers would be considered a violation. The words were calm. The effect was brutal. People started shouting again, anger cutting through fear. She let it happen, standing there quietly until it burned itself out. Then she dropped it. No snow crews would be allowed in until residents accepted revised snow fees. Increased fees. Immediate approval. No delay. The street went silent again, not because the storm had eased, but because everyone understood what that meant. This wasn't negotiation, it was leverage. The HOA wasn't waiting out the snow, they were using it. I looked around at the people standing there, bundled up, exhausted, scared. At the blocked road. At the untouched drifts. At the gate that separated us from help. That was the moment it stopped being about inconvenience or money or paperwork. The HOA had chosen to trap the neighborhood behind a locked gate and bury us under policy until we complied. And standing there in the cold, watching breath turn to frost and panic settle in, I realized this wasn't going to end on its own. By midday, the consequences stopped being hypothetical. The first call came from down the block. An elderly man had tried to walk toward the gate, thinking he could at least reach the cleared road on foot. I watched from my window as he moved slowly, shovel clenched in both hands like a third leg. Halfway down the slope, his boots slid. He went down hard, the sound of it sharp even through the wind. Two of us ran, lifting him carefully, afraid of what we might hear when he tried to stand. He kept saying he was fine, that he'd just lost his balance, but his hands shook so badly he couldn't grip the shovel anymore. We walked him back home in silence, all of us thinking the same thing and refusing to say it out loud. If he was seriously hurt, we had no way to get him out. The road didn't improve, it got worse. A delivery van tried to muscle its way in around noon. Tires spun, engine screamed, and then the driver gave up. He climbed out, looked around at the walls of snow, and left the vehicle right where it stopped, hazard lights blinking uselessly. Half the street was blocked now, but it hardly mattered. Nothing was coming through anyway. Then someone called for help. The details spread in fragments. A medical emergency. A panic call. Sirens approaching again. This time they were closer, louder, almost hopeful. I stood near the gate with a small group of neighbors, watching the lights bounce off the snowbanks as the ambulance crept toward us. And then it stopped. The driver stepped out, radio pressed to his ear, frustration written across his face. HOA security stood in front of the gate, unmoving. There was no shouting. No argument. Just a quiet refusal. We could hear the radio crackling, the driver explaining access issues, the words swallowed by wind. Minutes passed. The lights kept flashing. The cold sank deeper. Eventually, the ambulance shut off its siren. That sound, the sudden absence of it, landed harder than anything else. People stopped yelling after that. Anger burned out fast. Fear took over. Residents started trying to hire their own plow drivers. Cash offers, favors. Promises made through clenched teeth. Independent trucks showed up one by one at the entrance, engines rumbling, drivers confident they could help. HOA security turned them away just as quietly as the ambulance. Warnings were issued. Phones were held up recording. Drivers shook their heads and backed out, snow spraying behind them as they left. Inside our house, the reality started closing in without needing words. The heat ran constantly. Phones stayed plugged in. The pantry felt smaller every time I opened it. I watched my wife count the remaining cans of soup, sliding 2 to the back and pulling 3 forward to make the shelf look full. She closed the door a little too quickly so the kids wouldn't notice. The emails started again that afternoon. Formal notices. Polite threats. Warnings about unauthorized snow removal. Reminders that residents attempting to clear shared roads would be fined. The language was careful, bloodless, almost soothing. It read like a script meant to make resistance feel unreasonable. Outside, the wind rattled the siding. Inside, people stopped talking about tomorrow. Neighbors who had been vocal earlier now kept their doors shut. Curtains moved slightly, then stilled. Every slip on the ice, every distant engine noise, every radio alert sent a ripple of tension through the street. We weren't arguing with the HOA anymore. We were waiting to see who would be hurt next. Late in the afternoon, I walked back toward the gate, my breath frosting inside my scarf. Snow crunched under my boots, loud in the quiet. I didn't know what I expected to see. Maybe movement, maybe help, maybe nothing at all. What I saw was an ambulance sitting just beyond the entrance, lights flashing weakly against the white. The driver stood outside, shoulders hunched, talking urgently into his radio. HOA security blocked the way, arms folded, faces unreadable. No one raised their voice. No one moved. After a long moment, the light shut off. The ambulance turned around and drove away, tires disappearing down the hill, taking sound with it. Watching it leave was when the fear settled in for good. That night, I didn't sleep. The house was too quiet, every sound too sharp. Wind scraped along the siding. Snow slid off the roof in heavy, muffled sheets. I kept seeing the ambulance light shutting off, the way the silence rushed back in after. Anger had nowhere left to go, so it hardened into something else. I kept thinking about the paperwork, the stack everyone ignores. The documents you skim when you buy a house and swear you'll never need again. Covenants, bylaws, development agreements. Everyone treats them like background noise, until they aren't. A little after 3 in the morning, I pulled the old binder out of a storage box and set it on the kitchen table. One lamp on, coffee already cold by the time I poured it. I didn't read the way you read a book. I hunted. Page 100, nothing. Page 200, legal fog. Eyes burning, fingers numb from the cold creeping in through the windows. Then there it was, paragraph 4. Section C, emergency suspension of authority. The words didn't glow. They didn't announce themselves. They just sat there, quiet and precise, stating that during declared weather emergencies or when emergency services are impeded, access control authority is suspended. Roads must be opened. Contractors assisting emergency access are permitted regardless of HOA approval. I read it again. Slower this time. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. Later that morning, a neighbor knocked on the door. He looked wrecked, unshaven, eyes red but focused. He'd worked for the county years back, in planning. He said something else didn't sit right. The HOA had changed how the gate was operated last year. New controls. New enforcement language. But the permits? They'd never been updated. On paper, the county still treated our access road as conditionally shared during emergencies, which meant the HOA wasn't just being stubborn, they were overreaching. The pieces slid into place so cleanly it was almost frightening. The blocked crews, the calm confidence, the threats. They weren't improvising. They thought no one would challenge them. They thought paperwork would protect them. That was the moment I stopped arguing. I started documenting every blocked truck, every warning, every email, saved and time-stamped. I filmed the gate from different angles, captured security turning drivers away, recorded the empty road where plows should have been. Neighbors sent me their footage, shaky clips taken from porches and car windows. Screenshots of forecasts, copies of HOA notices. The ambulance incident from 3 different phones, no commentary. No emotion, just evidence. Then I made a call. County Emergency Management answered on the second ring. I didn't rant. I didn't accuse. I laid it out calmly. Storm conditions. Blocked access. Emergency vehicles denied entry. I referenced the development clause by number. I mentioned the unfiled permits. There was a pause on the line. long enough to tell me I wasn't wrong. They asked me to send everything. When I hung up, the house felt warmer, even though the thermostat hadn't changed. Outside, the HOA security truck still sat near the gate like it owned the road. Emails kept coming in, repeating the same warnings about fines and violations, but the tone had shifted. Sharper, shorter, less confident, like noise meant to drown out panic. I looked at my family, bundled up and quiet, trusting me to figure out what came next. I thought about the neighbors sitting behind closed doors, counting supplies, hoping nothing went wrong overnight. About how close we already were to disaster. The HOA thought intimidation was power. They thought silence would force compliance. They were wrong. I zipped my coat, stepped back out into the snow, and felt something steady settle in my chest. I wasn't asking anymore. I wasn't negotiating. I wasn't waiting for permission. I was done playing by HOA intimidation. The confirmation came quietly, which somehow made it heavier. County Emergency Management called back just after noon. No speeches. No threats. Just facts. They told me the HOA was obstructing emergency access. That under the declared conditions, the gate should never have been closed. And that once emergency services were impeded, the board's authority over access didn't apply. Then they asked when the HOA planned to meet again. That was when everything stopped being reactive. I called the snow contractor back. I told him to stage his trucks just outside the property and wait, not to argue with security, not to push the gate, just to be ready. I told him county officials would be present and that any fines issued would not stand. He didn't hesitate. He said his drivers were already fueled, already angry, already watching the weather reports like the rest of us. Word spread fast after that, but not through HOA emails. It moved house to house, text to text, porch to porch. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were suddenly comparing notes. One had saved every HOA email from the past year. Another had screenshots of the board acknowledging storm forecasts days in advance. Someone else had video of security turning away a plow truck while snow piled up behind them. We weren't speculating anymore. We were assembling a record. The HOA felt the shift immediately. That evening, an email hit everyone's inbox marked urgent. The board announced an emergency meeting to be held the next morning at the gate. Attendance strongly encouraged. The message accused unnamed residents of spreading misinformation and interfering with governance. It warned that outside involvement could expose the community to massive liability. The language wasn't calm anymore. It was sharp, defensive. Security presence doubled overnight. Extra trucks. Extra cameras. Notices taped to doors reminding residents that unauthorized snow removal or harassment of board members would result in fines. It felt less like management and more like a perimeter being fortified, but the fear wasn't sticking this time. Neighbors started checking in on each other, sharing power, sharing food, offering to stand with me at the meeting, not to shout, not to cause a scene, but to witness, to make sure whatever happened next couldn't be buried or denied. Late that night, county officials confirmed timing. They would arrive shortly after the meeting began. Law enforcement would accompany them, not to escalate but to ensure access if it came to that. I passed the word to the contractor. He said the trucks would be lined up and ready. Everything was set. Outside, the storm had finally eased, but the damage sat frozen in place. Snow packed hard against curbs, roads erased. The silence still hung heavy, but now it felt temporary, like a held breath instead of a threat. I reread the HOA emails one last time, noticing how often they used the word authority and how rarely they mentioned responsibility. Just before midnight, another message came through. No snow crews would be allowed in unless residents immediately approved the revised snow fees. No delay, no discussion. Compliance by morning or access would remain blocked indefinitely. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling something close to calm settle in. They thought this was an ultimatum. They thought tightening the screws would force submission. What they didn't realize was that they just put their entire strategy in writing. By morning, they wouldn't be facing a frustrated neighborhood anymore. They'd be facing the consequences of everything they'd done. Morning came sharp and bright, the kind of cold that burns your lungs if you breathe too fast. The storm had moved on, but it left everything locked in ice. The HOA chose the gate for the meeting, forcing everyone outside, boots planted on frozen ground, wind cutting through coats. Snowbanks rose on either side like walls, no shelter, no warmth, just a narrow strip of cleared concrete in front of a locked gate. People gathered in small clusters, shoulders hunched, breath hanging in the air. No one joked. No one lingered. You could feel the cold working its way through gloves, through layers, into bone. The HOA board leader arrived with security and a clipboard, calm as ever. She didn't wait for the crowd to settle. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She spoke softly, each word precise, forcing people to lean in. She talked about responsibility, about discipline, about how certain residents had created unnecessary panic. She didn't use names, but when she mentioned misinformation, her eyes found the same people every time. When she talked about reckless behavior, her smile tightened, polite and practiced. The message was clear. This was our fault. I didn't interrupt. I let her talk. She laid out the revised snow fees like they were a gift, a solution generously offered by the board. Private governance required sacrifice, she said. Private communities required order. When someone asked about emergency access, she dismissed it with a small shake of her head and repeated the word liability like it was a spell. As she spoke, I watched the people around me. An elderly man stood wrapped in a scarf, hands trembling despite thick gloves. Frost clung to the fabric around his mouth. A mother bounced her child slightly, trying to keep them warm. The wind pushed through the gate and whistled low, relentless. We didn't have time for speeches. Beyond the gate, down the hill, I could just make out the silhouettes of plow trucks waiting on the public road, engines off. Lights dark, ready. She couldn't see them from where she stood. That mattered. Eventually, she turned toward me. Her voice stayed calm as she accused me of interfering with board operations, of contacting outside authorities without approval, of encouraging residents to violate HOA rules. She announced enforcement action as if reading a grocery list. Fines, legal review, possible removal proceedings. Each phrase delivered gently, like she expected fear to do the work for her. Security shifted closer. Not threatening, just present. I felt eyes on me, waiting for a reaction, waiting to see if I'd fold, argue, shout. I didn't do any of it. I stepped forward, careful on the ice, and spoke evenly. I said the board had misunderstood something fundamental, not about money, not about rules, about authority. I said private governance doesn't override emergency law. That access control doesn't apply during declared weather emergencies. That fines don't matter when they're issued without jurisdiction. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. She smiled, small and tight. She asked for proof. She said the board had reviewed all applicable documents. She said there were no violations. She said any claims to the contrary were irresponsible and would be addressed. As she spoke, I saw the elderly man beside me sway slightly, catching himself on a snowbank. His breath came shallow now, visible in quick bursts. The cold wasn't waiting for us to finish this meeting. She continued anyway. That was when I cut her off. Not with a shout, not with anger. Just one step closer and a steady voice loud enough to carry. I said the HOA had forgotten something. Her smile flickered. I told her they had forgotten the documents they filed when this place was built. They had forgotten the permits they never updated. They had forgotten the emergency statutes that don't care about bylaws or fees or board votes. The wind gusted, rattling the gate. Somewhere down the hill, an engine turned over once, low and distant, then went quiet again. A vibration I felt in my chest more than heard. She opened her mouth to respond, to regain control, to drown it all in procedure. That's when I said it. I told her I had something the HOA had forgotten existed. And for the first time since the storm began, she didn't know what to say. The shift was immediate. The moment I pulled the papers from my coat, her expression changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. A fraction of a second where the calm slipped. I didn't raise them like a threat. I didn't wave them around. I read, Emergency Access Statutes, County Declarations. The exact clause from the original development agreement stating that during declared weather emergencies, access control authority is suspended. I read it slowly, clearly, letting every word land. Then I held up my phone and played the voicemail from County Emergency Management, the voice on the line, calm, professional, unmistakable. She tried to interrupt. I didn't stop. That's when the sound changed. A low rumble rolled up from down the hill, not loud yet, but heavy. I felt it first in my chest, a vibration through frozen ground and packed snow. Heads turned. Someone whispered. Then the county trucks came into view, lights flashing against the white, tires crunching steadily toward the gate. A patrol car followed close behind. The crowd shifted as officials stepped out, boots hitting ice with purpose. One of them walked straight to the gate without looking at the HOA board leader. "Open it," he said. She stepped forward fast, voice tightening now. She talked about private roads, contracts, liability. She threatened lawsuits, accused residents of manipulation, demanded the situation be paused until attorneys could review everything. The words spilled out, sharp and hurried, the calm gone completely. The county official didn't raise his voice. He said the HOA was being cited for obstructing emergency access. He said emergency vehicles had been impeded. He said the board had exceeded its authority. Then he said control over the private road was being temporarily revoked due to safety violations. Each sentence landed like a hammer. The patrol officer stepped closer as she kept talking, hands shaking now, confidence unraveling. Security shifted uncertainly, no longer sure who they were taking orders from. Someone in the crowd laughed once, short and disbelieving. Someone else covered their mouth. The wind whipped through the gate, cold and sharp, but no one felt it anymore. The gate began to move. Metal screamed against ice as it swung open, slow at first, then wide. The sound cut through everything, loud and violent, the first real noise in days that wasn't wind or sirens. From down the hill, engines roared to life. The lead plow surged forward. It hit the drift like a battering ram. Snow exploded upward in a towering wave, white powder blasting across the entrance as steel blades chewed into the blockade. Another plow followed, then another, lights flashing, engines roaring, salt sprang behind them. The road reappeared inch by inch under raw force and momentum. People cheered. Some cried openly. A few just stood there frozen, watching movement return to a place that had been locked in fear and silence. The HOA board leader tried to speak again, tried to regain control, but there was nowhere left to stand. County officials were already documenting everything. Security was told to step aside. The patrol officer spoke quietly to her, guiding her away from the gate as she protested, voice rising, words unraveling into nothing. She was escorted off the property she'd claimed to control. The plows didn't slow down. They carved through the neighborhood with practiced efficiency, exactly the way they always had before this board decided control mattered more than safety. Roads emerged from under packed snow, intersections cleared. Salt trucks followed close behind, spreading traction and sound and life. I stood there as the vibration from the engines faded into the distance, replaced by something lighter. Around me, neighbors hugged, shook hands, nodded at each other like survivors who didn't need words anymore. The cold was still there, but it no longer felt like a threat. The silence that had trapped us for days didn't end politely. It was shattered under steel blades and roaring engines, replaced by motion, noise, and the unmistakable feeling of relief rushing in as fast as the snow was finally pushed away. The roads were clear before the day was over. Plows worked through the neighborhood in steady loops, pushing back walls of snow that had felt permanent only hours earlier. Salt trucks followed, then emergency vehicles, then finally the ordinary sounds of life returning. Tires on pavement, doors opening, engines starting without hesitation. By nightfall, you could drive from one end of the community to the other without gripping the wheel in fear. The aftermath moved just as fast. County notices arrived within days. Obstruction of emergency access. Authority overreach. Failure to file permits. The board tried to hold itself together at first, issuing carefully worded statements about misunderstandings and procedural errors. But once the citations became public, the confidence evaporated. Resignations followed quietly. Meetings were canceled, lawyers replaced smiles. The HOA, as it had existed, dissolved under the weight of its own decisions. An interim management company was installed almost immediately, not hand-picked, not shielded, appointed with oversight and conditions. The gate stayed open. Emergency access language was posted in plain sight, no fine print, no interpretation games. Snow contracts were restored with clear timelines and accountability. For the first time since I moved in, decisions happened in daylight instead of emails sent after midnight. What stayed with me most wasn't the policy changes. It was the people, neighbors who had barely nodded to each other before the storm started stopping by, checking in, sharing coffee, laughing in that exhausted, slightly stunned way people do after surviving something together. The woman whose husband needed dialysis brought cookies to every house on the block, hands still shaking but smiling anyway. The elderly man who slipped on the ice waved from his porch every morning after that, like being seen mattered now. Trauma has a way of stripping away distance. In the quiet moments, when the trucks were gone and the roads were dry again, I kept replaying how close we came. How a locked gate and a handful of unchecked decisions nearly turned inconvenience into catastrophe. Power without accountability doesn't just become careless, it becomes dangerous. It starts confusing control with safety, authority with wisdom. This was never really about snow. It was about silence, about being told to wait, to comply, to stay quiet, even when lives were on the line. About how fast a community can be frozen when the people in charge stop listening, and about how quickly that freeze breaks when someone finally says no. Life settled back into something that felt normal again. Kids played outside. Cars came and went without fear of being trapped. Winter storms still rolled in. That part never changes up here. But now, they came with sound. Engines in the distance, steel scraping ice. Movement where there used to be nothing. Some mornings, I step outside just to listen. Not for sirens, not for silence. For the ordinary noise of a neighborhood breathing again, tires on cleared roads, doors closing, voices carrying faintly through cold air. Proof that what happened didn't just end, it mattered. The neighborhood isn't silent anymore. It's alive. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?